Hello and welcome to Tech Beyond Gender podcast. I'm your host, Meena Satishkumar. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Amanda Sterling. Dr. Amanda is an award winning leadership consultant and coach, globally recognized as a thought leader on humane workplaces. With nearly 2 decades in corporate leadership development, she's known for her research driven approach to diversity and inclusion, especially focusing on the experiences of mothers in leadership roles. She's the author of the acclaimed book, The Humane Workplace, and works with organizations to build high performing, inclusive cultures. Get ready for an insightful conversation on leadership, gender equity, and creating workplaces where everyone can thrive. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Amanda. We're looking forward to our
Thank
conversation.
you. Thank you for having me, Meena.
Great. I remember listening to your talk in Auckland Executive Club, and I was just extremely amazed by your work and how it's purely research driven, right? Now, before we dive into your incredible work on leadership and inclusion, I would like to hear more about your journey from childhood. What were some of the key moments that had really influenced your life and shaped your career path that led you to the work that you're currently doing?
I was a child of the 80s and 90s, and I was brought up to believe that women could do anything that they wanted to do as long as you just took advantage of the opportunities available to you. And I really lent into that and did some amazing things with my career, which I'm incredibly proud of. I've written a book, like you've mentioned. I've started and run businesses. I've worked for some incredible organizations, and really took advantage of being able to do anything as a woman. It was only after becoming a mum that I realized that doing being able to do anything meant that I had to do everything. And even then, I wasn't going to be recognized as a leader. And so that's the point where I started to come up against some of those gendered barriers that we experience being women in the workplace and women in leadership.
I remember from your talk that you were in a leadership role prior to your research and PhD. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, yeah. In a leadership role, doing leadership work. So my focus was on leadership development so supporting other leaders how to be leaders.
So how did you land up doing that? Like, did you have a psychology degree or something which sort of drove you into that path of coaching?
No, so I did an undergraduate degree and started my career working in HR, and then got really interested in learning and development. Fell into a role that I was quite lucky in that I was doing some temp work for an organization, and they were going through significant change and creating a new HR team, and I approached the HR manager in the kitchen one day and said, "Hey, I'm just here doing some temp work. It was menial admin stuff, but I've got a background in HR and I'm keen to do some stuff around learning and development. Could I be part of your team?" And she said yes. And I really got to write my own job description and ended up doing a lot of work around culture change and learning and development and leadership development and management development, and got to create a role essentially. And I ended up in this space of working with leaders, and helping them be better leaders and help lead their team to be high performing. And it led me down this path of going, well, actually, leadership development and leaders are critical to organizations being successful because they're the circuit breakers for teams. They're the ones that can either make or break, a thriving, high performing team or a struggling, low performing team. And so I got really interested in how do you build capabilities of leaders to create these teams that thrive and perform well. So it's, I guess, a long-winded way of how I got to working in the leadership development space.
So when you started working on the leadership development space, did you instantly recognize some form of biases within the teams? Or was it later on, after you became a mother, you sort of realized that things were a little bit biased?
Yeah, and so not at the time, no. And I think this was probably 10, 15 years ago, like well before I became a mum and experienced that. And being new into the space as well, I think my main focus was on leadership capability and how do you do that? Gender wasn't even an issue. And it wasn't like in the circles I was in, it wasn't even something that we really talked about. Like Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In was popular around that time. And I think the focus was really on how do we support women to lean in and take advantage of those opportunities, and still very much directed at how do we help women succeed within this system. I hadn't even begun to understand or even get a glimpse into how gender dynamics might be problematic for women at that point.
So you sort of realized that there is a problem after you became a mother, or was
Yes.
it before that? Was it after you became a mother?
Yeah, so it wasn't until I became a mum, and I guess I went back to work after maternity leave and got told that, well, shortly before I was due to go back to work after maternity leave, I got told that my maternity leave cover had been offered a role that was more senior to mine, and I was sort of pushed out of the interesting, challenging work that would require travel. And even at that time, I internalized that as my own failure. So I had failed at being a successful career woman because I had it in my head that I could be a mother and have a career, because that's what I had been led to believe. And so when I felt like I couldn't, that was on me. Like, as long as I took advantage of the opportunities, like that was my fault that I wasn't still able to. And so even at that point, I was going, this isn't a gender issue. This is a me issue. I failed, and it was a very individual experience. It wasn't until I started doing my PhD and got immersed in the literature that I went, oh my gosh, this isn't me. This isn't just me, because there were so many stories similar to my own where and these were stories captured in the research where women were struggling to progress their careers because of expectations that they perform like there's nothing going on with their body, these rhetorics we often place on women that it's a choice we make to exit the workforce to prioritize our families. Gender dynamics that mean that women are more likely to be passed over for promotion or be judged more harshly. And so I was then saying, oh my gosh, there's all this other stuff at play that has nothing to do with the effort and how skilled and capable and confident and committed I am. Actually, the system is set up in a way that doesn't value the skills and experiences that I bring, and our workplaces revolve around life cycles that don't include caregiving.
Mm. So what triggered a PhD and why this specific subject when probably because the reason I'm going back to it is you realized that it was not a me problem while you were doing a PhD when you started reading the
Yeah.
literature. But
Yeah.
until before that, you were sort of internalizing the issue, right?
Yeah.
So what actually pushed you to do a PhD in the first instance, and why this specific topic?
Yeah. So when I went back to work after my son was a year old, so after maternity leave, I really struggled. And, I was internalizing all of this stuff. I was told I lacked confidence, and I was going, what's wrong with me? I wasn't in I didn't feel like it was a particularly supportive workplace environment. I was leaving my baby at daycare and he was crying. And so I was separated for him. And I was just going, this isn't worth it. Like I'm working in a space where I don't feel like I can be myself. I feel like I'm being judged. I feel like I'm being sidelined. I was really like mentally struggling with that. I had, it's probably maybe TMI, but I had postnatal depression and I had dealt with that. And I found that when I was back at work, encountering some of this stuff, the depression was coming back too. And I mean, I can't actually stay here for my own mental health. I can't stay here. What else can I do? And so I started looking at other options and I was working with a coach at the time who supported me on that. And one of the options on the table was I could go and do a PhD. And I went, okay, I'm going to go and do that. My husband at the time, he was in a high paying job where he was traveling a lot. And so I was the default caregiver. And so it made sense for me to be able to prioritize caring for Joshua and then have something that still kept me mentally engaged as well. And so that was where the decision to do the PhD came from. And the topic was really like I started it to try and make sense of my own experience. And I actually started it with the question. So, because when you go into a PhD program, you've got to do a proposal of what you're going to research. And my proposal was to come up with a better way to develop women. So, I was still very much focused on how do I fix myself because I'm broken? What could I find in the research that would tell me something about how we can better design female leadership development programs? So that was actually my original research question. But it came from this place of trying to make sense of my own experience and what I could do differently and what I could do better.
Very interesting because while you're explaining your story, I can just relate to it so much more. I have research background, but I don't have a PhD. I've got double masters in research. But then eventually my career sort of landed up in technology now. And I'm doing something completely different to what I sort of started off doing.
Yeah,
Uh, and similar to you, I was also internalizing a lot of my experience working in technology. And I was wondering, okay, maybe something is not right with me. Maybe the way I'm communicating is not right, or something. I wasn't able
yeah,
to point and say what it is.
yeah,
And I often felt like, okay, maybe there's something I could learn and grow. And that sort of triggered me to do a research on my own last year. And it was not a PhD or anything, but it was more of an independent research. I sort of created a survey instrument, and it was just mainly to get perspective of women working in tech sector in New Zealand. So
yeah,
the more as like it was a comprehensive instrument, and when I started seeing the data as it was coming through, it was quite surprising. And there were a few women who actually contacted me and said, "Oh, I would actually like to share more of my story," and I couldn't read
yeah,
that in the survey. So then I sent out a message with the women who disclosed their contact details saying, if you want to take part in an in-depth interview, we could do that. We can complement it with that, with the survey instrument for the study. And some of them contacted me, and when I started having conversations with them in private, it was quite surprising. I was like,
yeah,
wow, there are others in the sector who are experiencing something similar.
yeah,
Like times it's easy for women to internalize things, right?
yeah,
And think that,
yeah.
okay, something is not right with me.
Yes. Because that's what we've been told. And this is the messaging that still comes through. And I see it. And we have this focus, this persistent focus on women in leadership development programs. And I
Mhm.
think women absolutely need support.
Mm.
But we keep telling women, you're the one that needs to be fixed. You're the one that needs to be developed. Well, you're the one that we need to focus on. And I think that then makes us go, like, there is no other place for us to put those thoughts we have other than on ourselves, because all of those other thoughts come from what we see, how we see women talked about in the media, like how we see role models, the behaviors in our organizations, what gets rewarded and recognized, how caregiving is valued and treated. Like all of those messages that we're surrounded by, we can't pin our experience on one of them, it's all of them, and yet we're consistently told that we're the ones that need fixing, and so that's the easy place for us to go,
Yeah.
because we can't, there's not enough messaging reinforcing actually it's the system and how work is set up and how we talk about women, like it's all of those things. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with women.
It's so interesting. Another thing that can just cross my mind is like you grew up here in a culture where you were told that you could do anything you want as a woman. Whereas I grew up in a culture where I was told explicitly that I can't do certain things because I'm a woman. And because I'm
Right.
a woman, I do need to know my boundaries, and I should be the one who needs to be flexible. So that's a sort of constant direct or indirect reinforcements that I've been
Yeah.
receiving from my
Yeah.
surroundings. And it's so good, interesting, even though we both have completely different upbringings and social context, we both started off internalizing our issues.
Yeah. 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 And it's interesting that it was made more explicit for you what those boundaries are.
Yeah.
Whereas, like from my perspective, it was where I was told I could do anything, but then the subtle implication was that when I get married and have babies, I should not, but I still should. And so there's like double messaging then happening. I was like, what am I supposed to be doing? Because I had parents, like my mother stayed home, my grandmother stayed home. I didn't actually have any of those role models. So I don't know I'm not quite sure where the drive to actually have a career came from. It probably came from school and being told those things.
Mm.
But that's interesting, and that because you've still pushed through those boundaries and limitations and created a
Yeah.
career as a woman in
Well,
leadership.
to be honest, even now, I continue to unlearn what I've been conditioned.
Yeah,
There is still, like there are certain times where I just completely lack confidence and I have to like just push through my thought patterns. There are certain things which I really have to push myself to do, go beyond my boundaries that I've set
yeah.
growing up. Yeah, I think it's just a constant learning process. But I've just decided, okay, whatever it is, let me just face the fear and just do it anyway.
Yes, yeah, but you've hit the nail on something. There's a process that we have to go through as women and constantly unlearning what we've been told about what it means to be a woman and have a career,
Mm,
but also not carrying that as our whole, like, what am I trying to say? We're constantly unlearning those things, but then also recognizing that that's not coming from us,
mm.
like that's not our fault. We don't lack anything. We're just trying to unpack this social conditioning that's not helpful for us.
Exactly, yeah. So now with your research, going back to your PhD, right? So what were the most surprising findings from your research?
So many surprising findings. I think the main thing that my research did was highlight how unhelpful norms of leadership were, and I was surprised by that. And so one of my key findings was the way these women talked about leadership. They either described it as a white male or a childless female. And I've got nothing against white males or childless females. Like I'm just saying that that's what we see in leadership. That's kind of like the behaviors and the life cycles and the work patterns that you see in those leadership roles. What that does is then impact women's experiences where they can't perform like a white male or a childless female. And it really highlighted how problematic the norms are for women's experiences. And I think that's quite powerful in shifting the conversation from what can women do differently to, okay, how do we change the norms of leadership? Um, and I think the surprising bit in there was because I think there's this, again, back to what we were talking about earlier, there's this focus on fixing women. But one of the things that came out of my research was this contradiction between how these women were talking about how they were valued as leaders outside of themselves and the value they put on themselves. And so to give this some context, I'm a discourse researcher. I don't go out and do surveys and that sort of thing. I ask people questions and then look for patterns in what they're saying and what context people are saying those things in and contradictions between what they're saying as well. And one of the things I noticed was there was this real contradiction between women describing how they had to prove themselves or that they lack confidence or they kept on using the words prove and lack. And I need to prove that I'm just as capable, confident, and committed now that I'm a mother. And so this need to kind of live up to a certain standard that they can't quite put their fingers on. But that was contradicted with where these women talked about their experiences of being pregnant and birthing babies and breastfeeding and then standing in their spaces of leadership. They described how becoming a mother had made them feel more powerful in their bodies, how they had a greater sense of what was important to them, how they were more connected to themselves and the communities and the people that they were leading. And so there was this real contradiction, like these same women talking about how they needed to prove something, but also how powerful they were. And I had one of my research participants, like I loved her words of describing it. And because she talked about her experience going through an IVF journey and how that was a struggle. But when she did become pregnant, how powerful she felt and how she had that greater sense of what was important to her. But then she talked about her transition going back to her CEO role. And she used the words like, I feel powerful in myself, but I don't think they have an appreciation of my skill set. And so there's like this real disconnect between the confidence these women held and the power that was then recognized within their organizations. And I think we often level at women, you lack confidence, or we internalize it ourselves, we lack confidence. But I think it's more of a mismatch between how powerful we are and how that gets recognized within organizations as leaders.
Yeah, there are a couple of things which just crossed my mind while you were talking about it. Now, you did talk about women, about them wanting to prove themselves going back after being a mom.
Yeah.
You think it's a trend just amongst moms or even like other women who don't have kids? Do they have similar issues where they go through this imposter syndrome, or do they feel that they have to work harder than their peers to prove themselves in workplaces?
Yeah, I haven't researched because my research was specifically around mothers and women in leadership. Although in saying that, so when I did when I was doing my literature review, I covered the breadth of research on women in leadership. And I think there is more work that women have to do. Like there was quite a lot of research around well, not quite a lot, but research around how women, we have a greater pressure to manage our bodies and look. It's like what I was talking about before, like looking professional and polished and perfect in order to establish our credibility in these spaces of leadership. And so I think there is more pressure on women in general because we're outside within workplaces, we're still outside the norms. And I think that becomes especially layered if you come from a different background or you have a different ethnicity or you're a woman of color, or like all of those intersectional factors start to play into that as well, because the norm is still quite predominantly white, Western, male. And so when you're not when you physically can't fit the norm because you don't look like it and it's there on your skin and your body, there's an extra layer of effort that you have to go to in order to counteract the assumptions being made about you.
Mm. That was going to be my second question about the role of ethnicity, right? So even if it's dominated by white male, even in other leadership roles, you do see a fair bit of women in those roles, but you don't really see women who look like myself.
No.
Rooms. I just feel yeah, it's a double whammy. If you're a woman and a woman of color, it just becomes even more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hate to say it, like, so when I did my literature review, and this is one of the things I talk about now, is that a lot of the leadership research is based on research done by men on men.
Mm,
The research that looks at the experiences of women in leadership is unfortunately done by women who look like me,
mm,
white,
mm,
on women who look like me, also white. And
mm.
so I think there's a real gap in understanding different experiences of leadership outside those white Western norms as well.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a woman on Monday. Uh, Her talk will be published very soon as well in our channels in another couple of weeks. And she is in a leading organization in Australia. And she mentioned to me how she's a woman of color, and she was explicitly said that there's no way she'll be considered for any leadership roles because of
Yeah.
how she is.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is quite disheartening and quite shocking as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's the bias leveled against women that just has multiple factors at play there. And so there's a pressure on us to manage how we come across and
Mm,
how we're perceived as confident and capable and committed and going to extra effort in order to do that. I mean, you've just got to look at some of the conversation leveled at Kamala Harris over
mm,
the past few weeks. And some of the ones I found like funny but not funny is how, Donald Trump is so incompetent, but an incompetent man can get into power, but a colored woman needs to go to additional efforts to prove herself. Like she's already
mm,
capable and intelligent and confident and all of those things, but all the bias against her, she's got to go to additional lengths to prove himself while a white male can just skate through. And I'm not saying that I have to keep on repeating this. I'm not anti-men and I'm not anti-white men. I've got a partner as a white man. I'm raising a white son. It's just we have to acknowledge the privilege that goes along with those roles. And that means that women, we do often have to work harder in order to be seen as legitimate.
yeah. So while you were doing your literature review and having conversations with other women, have you had discussions with them about pay parity in the industry?
So that wasn't pay parity wasn't part of my research
Okay.
question. So not in my PhD. So I don't know if I can answer that
Okay.
particular question. Um, yeah, I'm using the gender pay gap now is one of the metrics I use to help organizations understand where they've got gaps and how they can measure their progress to closing those gaps. Because if you've got pay parity and pay equity, then that indicates that you've got more women in leadership roles or that you're actually paying people fairly and all those sorts of things. And you're starting to remove some of those gender biases from how you recruit and promote people.
Hmm. So now that you're working with these organizations, what are the key elements in within organization, which you think we need to address uh, for women to truly thrive in leadership roles?
Another, these are all really hard questions. I think the starting point is having a conversation, but what I'm finding is that most organizations don't know what they don't know, or they don't know what the actual problem is. And so I think starting to understand what the issue is and having some challenging conversations about that. The second piece, I think, is switching the focus to changing the norms of leadership. And one of the ways that we can go about that is with men. So for a long time now, we've focused on women building their capabilities to step into leadership roles. And I think there's a real opportunity to support men in building capabilities for inclusive leadership. And so that's in recognizing their power and privilege and the lens that they view the world, building the critical skills to be open to other people's lived experiences and creating safety for people, storytelling and connecting people to what the organization is trying to achieve, and essentially helping create those inclusive workplace cultures. And so I think there's more work being done in that space. It's being called allyship, which I find quite challenging in that I think if we're calling women's leadership, we need to call it men's leadership as well. And so it's supporting men on those journeys. And I'm having some amazing conversations with and doing some great work with organizations at the moment, having those conversations. And they're really powerful because it's recognizing that some of these norms don't actually work for men either, like men who want to be more present and connected to their families, who want to be more vulnerable but might fear being judged as weak if they are. And so I think these are conversations that are great for everybody.
So, with these organizations, have you come across any strategy or anything that they have done to promote gender equity, which has come across being strikingly innovative and amazing and effective?
A good question. I don't know anyone who's doing this really well. There were women in my research and I can't name the organizations because the confidentiality of my research participants. But what they were doing, what their organizations were doing well, and these were businesses that had women in senior leadership roles, they had 50-50 representation. There were two things that was happening with those. The first one was, and this is unfortunate for entrenched and current big organizations, these were often companies where a woman had got sick of what was happening within their big corporate jobs, some of New Zealand's biggest companies, who had decided to then go and start up their own businesses and do it differently. And they were role modeling how to be parents and leaders at the same time and being quite explicit about their experiences and the cultures that they wanted to create. So they were doing it well. The second area was so these were where women were feeling that they could bring motherhood into their leadership, and they weren't trying to do this balance between these two being completely separate things. They were actually getting explicit support from their usually male CEOs who are saying, I recognize that you're a new mum or you just had a baby and this is a challenging time for you. What do you need in order to, whatever you need, you can bring your baby in, you can bring them to the conferences, you can have flexibility, and we're going to support your career. And they were being really explicit about what do you need to be successful in that role and then making it happen.
Mm. So, in the last 2 decades, you've been in the industry working with leadership teams, with coaching and development. Have you noticed any changes over the last couple of decades? Or do you think the culture and the trend has been the same?
I think I'm seeing changes around the importance of this work. and a greater recognition that actually diversity and inclusion is important. In more recent years, I'm seeing shifts to, okay, we're focused on diversity, but actually this isn't about just getting bums on seats and having more women in those roles. Do women in those roles feel that they can actually contribute something that doesn't require just conforming to whatever the norm is? So I think there's more conversation happening around that. Unfortunately, we're seeing very small shifts in representation of women in senior leadership roles, but it's almost like we take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, and those steps aren't significant enough to make meaningful, like quick long-term change. One of the and there's different ways of different places I've put numbers around that. So the UN Woman says it's going to be another, I think, 100 years before we achieve gender equality. And then there was a stat from, so McKinsey does a Woman in the Workplace award, Woman in the Workplace report every year, and they just released their 2024 report. And so they mostly study American businesses and American women's experiences. And so they were saying that it's going to be another 50 years before the American leadership represents the population of the country. So another 50 years. So you
Wow.
and I will be in retirement homes by then.
Yeah,
Isn't it? Something
we're not
like
going
that.
to be around when equality appears in 100 years' time.
Yeah, and so it just feels like too far away. And I get a bit frustrated by this because I still see a lot of doing the same thing but expecting different results. And I think countries like the UK, and I think it's a cultural thing because I mean, the British are usually a lot more polite, but I find that people in the UK, you can have more challenging conversations. I've
Hmm.
found that in the community over there. Whereas in New Zealand, I don't think we're as open to having challenging conversations about this stuff. And I feel like we're lagging behind on some of these things because I think part of that is it's a smaller market, it's a smaller town, everyone knows each other, you don't want to offend people. And so we don't actually get those conversations that we need to be having to move this forward.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree with that. Because for me, when I was internalizing a lot of the stuff and I started the research and then I started talking to women, that's when I realized, wow, there are many women who are going through similar experiences as me. And like even when we started off with the podcast, there were like few women who had so much stories to share with
Yeah,
me personally, were just absolutely reluctant to just come and have this conversation.
yeah,
Because they were like, okay, New Zealand is a small market. I can't just burn my bridges. I'm a contractor. I need to have my next contract. So there were like all these thoughts that were going on, right? So that I feel there is a lot of self-silencing
yeah,
happening. And I can completely believe that it could take like another 100 years or so because like if we are just so reluctant to speak about our own personal experience in public, then can you imagine in a boardroom that you might be the only woman amongst
yeah,
other leaders within the team?
yeah,
Like you could be one among another 2 or 3 women in a bunch of 10 people, right?
yeah.
So obviously, once again, there could be some self-silencing there. They might not feel that they have the space to share everything that they would want to share.
Yes, yeah, yes, yeah. And I feel like some of that comes about because we don't have enough women in those rooms. And so if we have more women in those spaces, then we might be more open to speak up about our different experiences. Or if we see other leaders talking up about those experiences, then we might be too. But I 100% resonate with what you're saying around like that fear of speaking up because it is such a small country and everybody knows everybody.
Yeah. like I don't know if with like coming from India, right? I feel this self-silencing is prominent in India as well, even though it's a massive country. There is like even for instance with me as well, like I grew up like with the conditioning, oh my God, what if someone else would listen to what you've got to say? So you
Yeah.
can't really brutally be honest. Any honesty was considered to be brutal. So you just have to sort of speak what is expected of you in a
Yeah.
specific environment.
So,
Yeah.
so how did you get around that? I'm curious about your experience in that because you're working in the space of challenging some of the gender norms around women in tech. So you were
Yeah.
being pretty honest.
Well, it took a long time for me to actually even speak up. So last like early this year when I first when I did the research, I had no idea of how what it could evolve to. So I did the research, I spoke to women, and I sort of felt there was a sense of responsibility. Like I just felt like the women who took part in the survey sort of trusted the process. And
Yeah.
the women who actually made time in their evenings to come and speak to me about their experiences, they also trusted the process. So I
Yeah.
sort of felt a huge sense of responsibility if they have gone through the effort of completing the survey and also coming and having this conversation with me. I can't just uh, summarize the results and then just
Yeah.
forget about it, right?
Yeah.
So that's when I decided, oh, I have to get someone's help to get the message out about this research. And there was this really good journalist, Wilhelmina Shrimpton, with whom I was working, and I gave the paper to her, and she was like very stoked with it. She was like, she's a journalist, and she thought there was
Yeah.
so much value in it. And I remember, like, even with that paper, I was so nervous about highlighting certain real issues and talking
Yeah.
about microaggression and stuff. I these like in my study, I highlighted those issues, but in my summary, I was sort of trying to be extremely diplomatic about it and highlighting things which were not so important.
Yeah.
And I remember when I got an opportunity to speak in the TV 3 a.m. show as well as in some of the radio interviews, she just pushed me to actually pick the real key issues. Talk
Yeah.
about microaggressions, talk about career advancement opportunities. And I was so terrified. I was
Yeah.
so terrified, to be honest. So, but then I felt like, okay, we've gone through the effort, we've done so much. Now we have no choice but to speak out about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. It's out there now that you're standing up for these things, so you may as well run with it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it was a huge push for me. But having said that, I've always been different in my family. Like, so I don't really adhere to the set standard of how a Indian woman need to be, or even a
Yeah.
woman needs to be. So I don't have kids. I'm quite independent, and I have a husband who supports me in all the other different pursuits that I want to undertake.
Yeah.
Whereas my family, my immediate family too, they're quite different.
Yeah.
So I did face a whole lot of issues. Um, where there was this constant, like, it's not just the people talking to me, like my parents explicitly saying what I'm doing is not right. It is
Yeah.
also like internalizing, as how we mentioned before. Oh my God, maybe I'm not doing the right thing. That
Yeah.
often constantly kept coming up. For me, I personally feel like the meditation, the yoga, it's more
Yeah.
to do with meditation and breathing exercises where you sort of just learn to relax and your whole perspective towards life changes the minute you
Yeah.
meditate. right?
Yeah,
So,
you come back to yourself, you come back to your center, and your center is your values and your identity and who you are and what's important to you, and you come back
yeah,
to that. Yeah,
yeah. And a lot of the times, I think we just have our identity of who we think we are is probably
yeah.
not right,
Or
isn't
the
it?
should, who we think we should be. Should
Yeah,
is a great beating stick for women, who we think we should be.
yeah. And best thing that I enjoy about meditation is about the experience where you transcend everything.
Yeah,
Like transcending your limited identity, who I am, what I am doing, and also my gender, right?
yeah,
In a way where you just sort of get to this very peaceful, quiet space, totally
yeah,
in the moment where nothing matters. And I
yeah,
feel like going back into that space, transcending everything, including my gender, gives me the strength to pursue and do what I'm doing.
yeah. Yeah, nice. That's such a beautiful insight, and for other women to learn from as well. 'Cause I meditate and practice yoga as well, and that's what that experience is like for me. And it's that grounding and that coming back to, okay, what are the things that are important to me? But you almost need to let go of everything else. Is that transcendence word that you mentioned? Like let go of all of the other things that are piling on.
Yeah, I think that's the only way you could possibly speed up the process of gender equality and not wait for another 100 years.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like any other technique, the is just going to be difficult because the
yeah.
minute we start talking about things and intellectually start putting our points across, you can always have a counter argument for it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But the intellectualism is an interesting one because it kind of it disconnects from your body. Like there's that mind body dualism dichotomy that I think we privilege how people think. We don't often think about how people feel or value that embodied experience within work and within leadership, that intuition, because it's not scientific, it's not tangible, it's feelings, it's emotions, which are more often associated with women and bodies and embodiment and all that sort of thing. But there's a if I can bring it back to the research, there's a space, and this is where my research sits, is when we recognize our embodied experiences, and I happen to research the embodied experiences of mothers, we're actually more attuned to our own humanity, and then we can be more attuned to other people's humanity as well, and
Yeah.
our vulnerabilities and our frailties as human beings, because we're not computers, we're humans.
Hmm. Yeah, just seeing everyone as humans makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
That's the first
yeah.
step.
Yeah, and I think that's the heart of diversity and inclusion is the recognizing your own humanity and then being able to recognize parts of your humanity in other people as well and go, actually, you're a human being too with thoughts and feelings and fears and hopes and dreams and all those sorts of things. And then you start to appreciate other people's experiences that are
Yeah.
different from your own and hold space for those.
Yeah. Now, this leads me to another question about your book, Humane Workplace. So, what is that about? Is that from your PhD research, or was this again a different independent work that you were doing?
Yeah, so the Humane Workplace was actually a book I wrote maybe 9 years ago now. I can't actually remember. And so that came about because I founded a social enterprise called NZ Lead, which was about connecting people and culture people together from all around the world to reimagine how we approach work differently. And it was enabled by technology. And the book ended up being about, so it was called The Humane Workplaces, but it was about social technologies and how social technologies could actually make our workplaces more humane, but only if we put people first. And so what I was noticing that was that more businesses were using like tools to connect people. I mean, and we've seen this change quite significantly since COVID, but using these tools and technologies to connect people across organizations. And the technology was coming first and going, okay, if we put these things in place, we can connect people and there'll be more collaboration and we'll have enhanced cultures and all of those things. And what I was seeing was actually those, if you put technology first, actually that depersonalizes. You need to actually go, well, how do human beings connect and collaborate and communicate? And if you focus on those things, how can you enhance learning and people and culture practices and recruitment and authentic experiences and leadership and all those sorts of things? So the book is, I mean, it's quite old now, but I think some of the messaging is quite timely because we've got AI as the big thing now, and there's this whole, the fear and possibility of that around it's going to take our jobs, but actually there's this opportunity to go, well, how do we use these tools to take away some of the menial stuff that actually gives us more space for reflection and connection and creativity and those sorts of things. But I think there's still a real risk that we'll go, oh, bright, shiny technology and focus on that rather than going, okay, how do we connect with ourselves more?
Mm.
And I think that's the powerful, like that's the more powerful question. Yeah, I think there's some real dangers with technology that take away our humanity. And I think we kind of need to flip that and go, how do we bring humanity back into this? It
Yeah.
might be a very esoteric question.
Well, actually, to be honest, with from COVID, right, I actually really started valuing technology for a different aspect because we were not allowed to go out and do things, but there were meditation retreats which I could do just sitting in my living room and
Yeah,
meditated with hundreds of people around the world.
yeah,
And I felt like that sense of belongingness and oneness, once again, going back to our previous conversation, which is completely irrelevant to what we had originally organized this meeting for. It's like I just felt like how we could even transcend gender or transcend our limited identities.
yeah,
I just felt that was made so much more accessible because of technology. And
yeah,
technology at the end didn't matter because you just dropped all of your limited identities and boundaries. So you just sort of
yeah,
felt a sense of belongingness with everyone, literally, or with everything, be it nature or anything for
yeah,
that matter. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it's, the technology wasn't the fix for you. It was the connection to other people, and that was the
Yeah.
valuable piece.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think the technology sort of helped me as well at that time when I
yeah.
couldn't go out anywhere, but I just sort of felt
Helped
like,
a lot of people during
yeah,
COVID.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what were the unique challenges which you found that mothers in leadership roles were facing?
Oh, I think that the main, I mean, I researched the experiences of mothers because, I mean, one of the reasons was that a lot of the research around leadership was very white male, and it doesn't actually account for embodied experiences. And so what these women were coming up against were norms of leadership that didn't account for the life cycles of women. So menstruation, maternity, and menopause. So whether even if you've not become a mother, you're probably going to go through menopause at some point. And those things aren't like there's more talk about them now, but that's still quite emergent. So it kind of, they're coming up against these norms that didn't really recognize the experiences that women had. And so around the life cycles, around the work patterns. So when you've got young children, you're breastfeeding or you're pregnant, so you're exhausted, you're sleep deprived, you're having to pump or breastfeed, there's care of this. It's quite an embodied process. And so these women were finding that there wasn't a lot of capacity to bring those things into their work environment. So they're often having to hide those experiences. And so it just comes back to highlighting the like norms of leadership that are particular behaviors, life cycles, work patterns don't account for the experiences that women have. And so these women were, because they couldn't avoid what was going on with their bodies, because their breasts and bellies and everything was right there, they were continually coming up against these barriers to being seen as legitimate leaders. So not just turning up to work, but actually being perceived as legitimate. And then they're having to, because they weren't, they were having to go to additional lengths to prove that they were capable, be performing and present, or feeling that they have to hide their experiences.
Yeah, I like, as you mentioned, there are more organizations making an effort to talk or bring awareness about menopause and stuff, right? But once again, going back to what we were talking about self-silencing, often wonder how many women would actually be completely comfortable to express that to their team or their leaders, saying that I'm
Yeah,
going through symptoms or I'm going through menopause at this stage, because they could be judged, right?
yeah,
As it is, I feel as a woman, you sort of need to put in too much effort to prove yourself. Now,
yeah,
that I'm going through a process and I'm having brain fog, am I actually landing, I'm digging a grave for myself doing that,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And then you can't, you're not role modeling it out to other women as well. I think, yeah, I was reflecting on that today because I went from becoming a mum early, like early days of having a young child to straight into perimenopause. And that what that means for me is that I go through stages where I'm exhausted and I don't know why I'm exhausted. I eat healthy, I exercise, I do all of the right things, and I'm just exhausted. And I had this situation this week because I'm in that exhausted state that I went, I need to reprioritize some things this week and I can't do everything that I set out to do. And so there was a meeting that I actually had tomorrow that I went, I need to postpone that. What do I say? And I felt like such a, I don't know, like I did actually end up being honest with her, but I had this moment of going, like, is she going to think this is an excuse, or I'm going to come across as weak, or I don't have my stuff together, or that I'm not consistent, or that, I commit to things and I can't follow through on them. And so I had all of these thoughts going on in my head because I was rescheduling a meeting and she was really understanding about it, and so it all turned out fine. But it was all that, like I almost self-silenced myself because I think it's easier to say to people, oh, I've got a cold, or I'm just really busy, like, because people get that, rather than going, I have perimenopausal exhaustion, because one, that feels like TMI, and then two, that feels like you're then unreliable because
Yeah.
you're not consistent.
Exactly. Yes, yes. I can imagine the pressure women in leadership roles would face, right?
Yes, because there's an additional expectation if you're in a leadership role to be performing and present and on your game, you've got extra responsibility, you're visible, like all of those things. So you've got to look like you've got your ducks in a row. And it's really hard to do that when you're then having to soldier through these embodied experiences that aren't conducive to looking like you've got it all together, or that you have all the energy, or that you have everything to give to people.
Yeah. So, what advice would you give to women who have these challenges?
I really hate giving advice to women.
Well, you're a coach, aren't you?
Yeah, but when I coach, I tend to ask more questions than anything else. And I hate giving advice because, one, I think every woman's experience is different, and my experience is completely different to theirs. But I also don't think that this is like, there are other people who work in this space who give better advice than I do. But I also think we need to shift the conversation into, okay, well, how do we support other women with these experiences? And what do we then need to role model? So I guess probably coming back to that, if I was to give one piece of advice, it would be to think about what you're role modeling to other women coming through. And even if you don't want to do it to yourself, like do it for yourself, think about what example you're setting for other women. Because if you're soldiering on looking like you've got everything together and soldiering, whether that's through having your period or having a baby or going through menopause, you're then showing other women that they also need to soldier on through all of those things, and it just perpetuates this whole cycle. And I think this is advice that men can take on as well. Like, what are you role modeling? Because if you're working all of the hours and you're taking on behaviors that are aggressive or dominant, or you're leaving it to your wife to pick up the kids from school, or all those sorts of things, then what example are you setting for not just the other men, the woman coming after you, but the other men as well? And so it's really like, what are you role modeling? Because
Mm.
what you're role modeling is so powerful for those that are coming after you. And so, the question I asked myself today is like, if I'm honest about my experience, then I'm giving someone, like in a teeny tiny small way, license to then be honest about their experience as well, whether that's to me or to somebody else. And so it makes me feel really vulnerable and self-conscious, but then I'm kind of trying to role model something different.
Mm. Say if there's an organization who's like really keen to actually take proactive steps to build inclusive teams within their
Yeah.
organization, but they don't know where to start from, what would be your advice? Where can they actually start planning their progression towards a diverse team culture?
I mean, they can book me to come and do a session with me if they want to start there, because I am actually working with some incredible organizations who are having those exact conversations. And it's either a conversation where I share my work and my research and the questions that it raises about women in leadership and how it shifts the focus to the norms of leadership and what we need to do to address that. Or it's starting those conversations around how do you recognize your power and privilege, and how do you lead in an inclusive way, and how do you build those capabilities as a leader to be inclusive? And I think those are two very powerful places to start, is starting the conversations and building those capabilities. And I think, and those are two things that are in the work that I currently do with organizations now. And I'm having incredible conversations with, and some of my favorite conversations are with men, because it's just it's around how these norms don't serve men either, and helping them recognize the power and privilege they have and what they can do differently. And I think that's so powerful. And that's the exciting bit for me, because I start to see people go, oh my gosh, I actually have the power to do something about this. And that changes things for not just the woman coming after me, but my sons and daughters as well, in the world that they're growing up in. And that's incredibly exciting.
So, do you work only with the leadership team, thinking about diversity within the leadership teams, or are you do you take a bigger picture on how to create diverse teams within an organization?
I do both.
Mhm.
I just done some work around inclusive leadership with a mostly male leadership team, and then have just done a pitch for the same organization to do some work around inclusive teams and how they build, like everybody in the team builds the awareness and accountability for those inclusive cultures within their teams. So it's an evolving space where I'm going, okay, how can my work be of best value for organizations to shift some of these conversations and build the capabilities to do this? So it's really about like who's up for it.
You also mentioned about how in New Zealand being a small market, things are a little bit different as opposed to other countries. So have you, in your previous research, have you noticed any significant difference in the way we operate within New Zealand compared to other countries globally?
I think I haven't researched different countries because my research is New Zealand specific. But back to one of the earlier questions we have, I've noticed different conversations because I've done work in the UK and New Zealand, and I just notice a difference between the openness and receptivity to some of these conversations versus New Zealand. And I think they're more advanced in some of their thinking, which is, we can then look and go, okay, so what are we doing overseas? And even in Australia are having more progressive conversations around some of this stuff. And so what can we learn from overseas?
Yeah, have you come across any articles or any studies specifically to tech? Because again, gender diversity is something that I feel we really need to focus on
Yeah.
within the technology sector. Is there anything that you have come across?
Yeah, so when I was doing my original literature review, there was an interesting piece of research about and having tech careers. And it was a critical piece of research in that it kind of it raised questions and critiqued some of their understandings about this. Because what they I think it was interviews from memory, what they were looking at was women's experiences in tech. And what these women were saying was we don't have a gender issue. And it's interesting and relevant to me now because I actually see this in some of the conversations I have with organizations. They say we don't have a gender issue. As long as you navigate this environment, you'll do fine and you can advance your career. But what that tends to do is go when people say we don't have a gender issue, like being a woman isn't an issue within this space, it's more to do with being gender blind than gender isn't actually an issue. It says, okay, gender isn't an issue as long as you can assimilate to the masculine work environment and the masculine norms, is that you can fit in with those norms. And so this research kind of unpacked some of the language that they were using around describing this issue and just went, okay, there's this pervasive idea that gender isn't an issue, but we're thinking it's not because these women are just assimilating really well to the environment,
Mm.
not necessarily bringing diversity into it though.
Yeah, I have read few literatures around that as well. And again, it's even though you try to assimilate, it just becomes very difficult because certain actions can be perceived as being aggressive when it
Yes.
comes from a woman, but when it
Yeah.
comes from a man, it's like, gosh, he's displays really good, amazing leadership skills. He's assertive.
Yeah. Yes, and then you end up with this gender double standard. And so they go, well, gender's not an issue, but if you're a woman displaying aggression or dominance or just being assertive, you're bossy. And so you get these terms and these microaggressions start to come through. But they go, well, gender's not an issue here. It's just your behavior. And that's where that behavior then gets individualized as well. Like there's something wrong with you. You need to work on yourself rather than going, actually, there's a gendered bias at play here that isn't helpful.
And also, it can be perceived as someone going through perimenopause or menopause, and that could be the reason they're displaying certain character, like certain
Yeah,
behaviors, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which isn't a bad thing. It's just the lens that we go, okay, that's that just makes it more complicated.
Yeah, yeah. It just becomes, I just feel like at times it just becomes very complex when you add another layer of complexity to it too, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah. But it's I think we try and simplify things, and that's where a lot of the bias comes from, is us as human beings who have a lot going on, just trying to simplify our worlds.
Mm.
And so we attach bias and labels to things in our minds because then that's an easy way for us to categorize and understand, put people in a box. But I think the trick is being open and curious about different lived experiences and challenging some of our own assumptions about the boxes we're putting people in.
Yeah, so what drives you personally to continue advocating for gender diversity?
What drives me, I think I don't have a big like world changing purpose in mind. Some of my core values are challenge and excellence. So
Mm,
I'm continually looking for ways that we can do better and that we can improve the experiences for women and for women in leadership. And so it's just continually like I probably get more enjoyment out of this might not be the right answer to it, but I get more enjoyment out of going, well, how can we do this better? Like what's working, what's not working? How can we kind of push the boundaries of this and demonstrate like how can we get more women into leadership so that we can create, better businesses, a better society, and so that it meets our needs in different ways. And so it's really just that challenge and that continual drive to do better. And that's that search for excellence for me. And underneath that is just I want to build a business that lets me do meaningful work and show up as a parent.
mm.
So I go out and do this stuff, but the underlying driver is just I want to do good work that lights my fire and that I can still show up for my son and pick him up from school. I'm not really like if I change the world in a small way in the process, that's great, but I'm not going to do that at the expense of just being a present and connected parent.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. Cool. Thank you so much for your time, Dr.
Meena?
Amanda. Before we finish off, one last question. Is there anything that you can suggest, like one action that organizations can take to support women in leadership roles?
Get me to come and talk to them or come and support them. Um, I think it's coming back to that question is what can you role model?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, organizations are made up of a collection of people and a collection of leaders. And so, what can those leaders role model that would inspire the next generation to want to do their roles? Because what I'm seeing in the work that I'm doing is that a lot of organizations are stagnating around getting more women into leadership.
Mhm.
And in the conversations I'm having, what I'm hearing from women is them going, if that's what leadership looks like, if that's what it takes, if that's the behaviors, if that's how I'm going to be talked about and talked to,
Mhm.
I don't want to do it.
Mm,
And so I think that this next wave is going to come from how do you role model leadership in a way that the next generation of women and men actually want to do those roles. I'm keen to talk to more organizations who want to do the work in this space. And that's the conversations that need to be had, the capabilities that need to be built, and that's for men as much as the support for women.
great. Thank you so much, Dr. Amanda. Thanks for your time. I know you're a busy mom and it's school holidays as well.
He's actually at his grandparents, so I've got a pass today. But
Oh,
thank you so much for having me, Meena. I enjoyed our chat.